Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 11, Prostitution, Slave Codes and Revolts, and the Great Awakening. When presenting an episodic look at American history, I have done my best to flesh out every decade, if not every year, of our history books. Usually this is not a problem, as there are enough stories and anecdotes of stuff to go around. I end up having to record extra content as I refuse to trim the fat of our history. But I must be honest with you, it's been a rough one this time around. There are not many events that made a more massive splash on the historical scene in the early 18th century, at least in the terms of the United States. That is not to say that critical things did not happen, especially in the global scheme of things. But the content in today's episode will skip around quite a bit. We even almost work our way up to the American Revolution. Also, let me backtrack a second. If she's listening, my beautiful wife is rolling her eyes because I used the phrase, quote, "I must be honest with you," end quote. This, of course, implies that I have not been honest up to this point and can trivialize my narrative up to this point. She works in sales, and she deals in lies like currencies. But as historians, our trade is not that different. Every historical figure is a salesperson trying to sell you their narrative. And as detectives, we need to determine if we accept the lies as truth or find the truth to be lies. Keep reading through our history. Can you tell me what is fact and what is fabrication? Prostitution Part One. Here's a great way to grab your attention to start off with. As Europeans settled in North America, the population consisted almost exclusively of men in search of the traditional life, liberty, and property. History obscures the baser desires of these original colonizers: sex. Few men brought their wives and children to the colonies, but they still required an outlet for their sexual passions. The small number of women who lived in the colonies experienced relative freedom, and prostitutes from Europe clustered in the New World, like the men looking for fortune, sexually serving men arriving in the colonies. With the stabilization of the colonies, families joined the men, and institutions such as churches sprung up to meet the newcomers' needs. The sex trade continued to expand as merchants and sailors replaced some, if not all, of the family men. Female indentured servants, if they chose not to marry after manumission, found sex work lucrative. Protests from clergy and Religious Voice of Boston succeeded at getting brothels outlawed in 1672. Because women could no longer work out of brothels, many took their business into public and solicited the streets. By 1699, open prostitution offended communities to the extent that several larger cities passed laws against night walking. However, prostitution continued to flourish into the 18th century as women disregarded the rules and officials became lax concerning enforcement. American prostitution was rare and clandestine and practiced mostly on a casual basis through the mid-18th century. Occasionally, tavern owners were prosecuted for operating disorderly houses. Still, such cases were rare, and the penalty was a small fine or a few lashes, a slap on the wrist by colonial standards. In the early 1700s, Boston minister Cotton Mather attempted to form a group to oppose brothels, but met widespread public indifference due to the relative invisibility of the problem in America. Sex workers multiplied dramatically by the mid-1700s. American cities began to grow along with the maritime trade. That brought increasing number of sailors and brothels open to suit them. When George Washington was a young man, brothels could be found in port cities like New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Newport. In 1753, Bostonian Hannah Dilley pled guilty to permitting men to, quote, resort to her husband's house and carnally to lie with whores, end quote. Dilley was sentenced to stand on a stool at least 5 feet in height outside the courthouse holding a sign describing her offense. Prostitution was ubiquitous in Philadelphia's Helltown, the prototype for the first red light district that would spread across America in the next century. Benjamin Franklin himself admitted to hiring his share of strumpets, as he called them. While we do not know whether Alexandria had its own bawdy house when Washington passed through, it was a growing port city with a large transient population. Colonial era brothels did not post flyers, but a would-be patron could learn about their services in the tavern or from his shipmates. Despite Mather's early efforts, there was no systematic attempt to close the urban brothels. Men were rarely prosecuted for soliciting a prostitute, and the prostitutes themselves were only occasionally brought before the judge. When government officials did not order a raid, the police didn't always cooperate. Many police officers protected the brothels in exchange for money, food, and payments. Working-class neighbors, irritated by official inaction, would periodically riot and burn down a brothel. There is little record of sex toys, let alone a sex toy industry, from colonial America's era. To the extent that colonials used sex props, they would have made them on their own. In one of the few references to sex and inanimate objects from the time, a 17th century New York court described a prostitute flamboyantly measuring her clients' penises using a broomstick. Nevertheless, there were plenty of brothels in the colonial era, especially in port cities like Alexandria. (1705) The Virginia Slave Codes. Slavery begins to take a more definitive shape during the early 18th century and starts to separate itself from indentured servitude. Before 1705, there were many African American indentured servants in the state of Virginia. For a set number of years, a person would work without pay and then be freed from his bond once the allotted time had passed. In 1705, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law that transformed black indentured servants into slaves. The Virginia Slave Act of 1705 condemned many men, women, and children to a lifetime of slavery, even if they were only days away from being freed from their indentured status. Before the Slave Act of 1705 was enacted, indentured servants over the age of 19 had to work for 5 years before achieving freedom. Indentured servants under the age of 19 had to work until they had reached the age of 24. The Slave Act codified slavery and allowed white Christians to beat, torture, and kill slaves with impunity. This act glorified an incident of being born white and Christian, placing all others as inferior status. According to the law, being white was more important than becoming Christian, as Christian slaves were still slaves and could be murdered and tortured without any legal recourse. The 1705 Slave Act consisted of many parts, including the following laws. Part 4 of the Slave Act turned indentured servants into slaves, even if they were just days from the end of their contracted term. All servants brought from non-Christian lands became slaves. Subsequent conversion to Christianity did not affect the person's status. All servants were now considered slaves. The only exception were Turks, Moors, and servants from Christian countries, like England, who had proof that they had been free in their former country of residence. Part 11 of the Slave Act included the following requirements. Non-white people were not allowed to purchase any white Christian for indentured servitude. African Americans and Indians could not have indentured servants, even if they were Christian. People described as infidels, like Jews, Moors, and Muslims, were prohibited from having any white Christian servants. However, servants of the same complexion, or Indian and African American slaves, were allowed for Jewish and Islamic freemen. This section of the law also freed any white Christian servant who was purchased by an infidel, and released any white Christian who had a whiter master who married an infidel. Part 23 of the 1705 Slave Act was written to encourage other white free people to hunt down and capture escaped slaves. A reward system involving tobacco was set up for people who caught runaway slaves. Increasing amounts of tobacco were awarded to the capturer according to the distance the slave had traveled. Slaves were found more than 10 miles away from their residence brought a reward of 200 pounds of tobacco to the capturer and another 200 pounds of tobacco to the county where the slave was found. Slaves found from 5 to 10 miles away from the residence brought a reward of 100 pounds of tobacco to both the capturer and county where the slave was located. This was considered an encouragement for people to hunt down and return slaves to their owners. The owner of the slave was required to pay the reward, and the justice of the peace who presided over all cases must note the name and location of the taker-up, the name of the slave, and the name of the location of the owner. Careful record-keeping ensured the owner of the slave paid the levy in the event a slave was captured. A new occupation was born with high rewards. A slave dealer made a living off of capturing both runaway slaves and freedmen, selling the latter back into slavery. Clayton Hulbert is one such story. His owner died, willing the slaves their freedom rather than deeding them out to another landowner. Clayton's mother and grandmother were freed upon their owner's death, but slave dealers kidnapped the women and sold them back into slavery. Clayton's mother was sold to the Hulbert family in Tennessee, and his grandmother was sold to a plantation in Texas. The two women never saw each other again. Clayton was born while his mother was a slave on the Hulbert plantation, so he also became a slave. Part 26 of the Slave Act required any slave captured across the Chesapeake, that is, across the Mason-Dixon line to the north, to be handed over to the sheriff. The sheriff would send the slave back across the bay into the hands of a Southern constable. The Southern constable was then rewarded with 500 pounds of tobacco from public stores and reimbursed by the slave owner. Part 32 of the Slave Code prevented any plantation owner from granting a safe harbor to another person's slave. No landowner could allow a slave to stay on his or her land for more than 4 hours without the express written permission of the slave owners. A violation of this law resulted in a fine of 150 pounds of tobacco. If a slave owner killed or maimed a slave, it would be considered as if the accident had never happened. This part of the law allowed white slave owners impunity for their actions. No matter how horrendously they treated, tortured, or killed their slaves, the law would ignore the actions. This part of the law also required 30 lashes for any non-white who raised a hand against a Christian. If the Christian was also non-white, however, the law did not apply. Only white Christians were considered worthy of protection from violence according to this law. Baptism and conversion to Christianity would not alter the status of slavery for non-white people. Children were considered slaves or free according to the status of their mothers. No other circumstance mattered. Other portions of the 1705 Slave Act set punishments for servants who owned no property and could not pay a fine as punishment for any action deemed criminal. The Slave Act declared 20 lashes by whipping to the equivalent of a fine of 500 pounds of tobacco or 50 shillings. Any white man or woman who married a person of African or Indian descent would be committed to jail for 6 months without bail and would have to pay 10 pounds as a fine. The New York Slave Revolt of 1712. Slaves eventually began to organize against the injustices being perpetrated against them. New York Slave Rebellion of 1712, a violent insurrection of slaves in New York City, resulted in brutal executions and harsher slave codes. The population of New York City in 1712 numbered between 6,000 and 8,000 people, of whom approximately 1,000 were slaves. Unlike southern plantations, where groups of slaves were relatively isolated, the slaves in New York City were in frequent contact with each other, even if owned by different people. The Rebellion of 1712 was instigated by African-born slaves, who used African-based religion tenets to encourage other slaves to revolt. calling for a war on Christians. On the night of April 6, 1712, a group of slaves set fire to an outhouse at Peter Van Tilburg on Maiden Lane at what was the northern edge of Manhattan. The fire was a signal to other slaves to begin the revolt. When the white people came out of their homes, they were confronted by a band of 23 slaves, though some sources say they were anywhere between 50 to 100, standing in front of the burning house, armed with guns, axes, and knives. The slaves fired into the crowd of whites, causing panic. Some ran to a fortification on the lower tip of Manhattan to alert the New York governor, Robert Hunter, who sent the militia to deal with the rioters. Upon seeing the armed soldiers, the rioting slaves ran north towards a wooded swamp. Along with armed bystanders, the soldiers swept the city for the rioters, capturing many of them near present-day Canal Street. 9 whites were killed in the riot, and 6 were wounded. Rather than await trial and inevitable incarceration, or worse, 6 slaves committed suicide. Of the approximately 40 slaves brought to trial, 18 were acquitted, and a few others were pardoned. The rest were brutally executed. 4 were burned alive, a wheel crushed one was kept in chains until he starved to death. A pregnant woman was kept alive until she gave birth, and then was executed. And the others were hanged. In response to that slave rebellion, strict codes were enacted, which included, but were not limited to, harsher punishments as the slaveholders saw fit, decreased contact among slaves, and prohibited slave-owned firearms. (1739) Stono Rebellion. There are many tales throughout history that have regional flair but are often unheard to the larger scheme of the account. This is one of those accounts. Since 1708, most of the South Carolina colony population were enslaved Africans. As the importation of laborers from Africa had increased in recent decades with labor demand for the expansion of cotton and rice cultivation as commodity export crops. South Carolina had become a slave society, with slavery central to its economy. As planters had imported many slaves to satisfy the increased demand for labor, most slaves were native Africans. Many in South Carolina were from the Kingdom of Congo, which had converted to Catholicism in the 15th century. Numerous slaves had been held in the British West Indies, where they were considered to become seasoned by working under their slavery before being sold to South Carolina. With the increase in slaves, colonists tried to regulate their relations, but there were always negotiations in this process. Slaves resisted by running away, work slowdowns, and revolts. At the time, Georgia was still an all-white colony without slavery. South Carolina worked with Georgia to strengthen patrols on land in coastal areas to prevent fugitives from reaching Spanish Florida. In the Stono case, the slaves had been inspired by several factors to mount the rebellion. Spanish Florida offered freedom to slaves escaped from British colonies. The Spanish had issued a proclamation and had agents spread the words in the British colonies about giving freedom and land to slaves who reached Florida. Tension between England and Spain over territory in southern North America made slaves hopeful of reaching Spanish territory, particularly the free black community of Fort Mose, founded in 1738 outside St. Augustine. Stono was 150 miles from the Florida line. A malaria epidemic had recently killed many whites in Charleston, weakening the power of slaveholders. Lastly, historians have suggested the slaves organized their revolt to take place on Sunday, when planters would be occupied in church and unarmed. The Security Act of 1739, which required all white males to carry arms even to church on Sundays, had been passed in August of that year in response to early runaways and minor rebellions, but had not fully taken effect. Local officials were authorized to mount penalties against white men who did not carry arms after the 29th of September. Jemmy, the revolt leader, was a literate slave described in an eyewitness account as Angolan. Because of trade patterns, he was more likely from the Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa, which had long had relations with Portuguese traders. His cohorts of 20 slaves were also called Angolan and likely were also Congolese. The slaves were described as Catholic, with some spoke Portuguese, learned from the traders operating in the Congo Empire at the time. The trade patterns and the fact that the Congo was a Catholic nation points to their origin there. The Kingdom of Congo leaders had voluntarily converted to Catholicism in 1491, followed by their people. By the 18th century, the religion was a fundamental part of its citizens' identity. The nation had independent relations with Rome. The region had slavery before introducing Christianity to the royal court of Congo, and the kingdom regulated it. Slavery was still practiced as late as the 1870s there. Portuguese was the language of trade and one of many languages of educated people in Congo. The Portuguese-speaking slaves in South Carolina were more likely to have learned about Spanish agents' freedom. They would also have attracted to Catholicism of Spanish Florida. In the early 18th century, Congo had been undergoing civil wars, leading to more people being captured and sold into slavery, including trained soldiers. Jemmy and his rebel cohort were likely such military men, as they had fought hard against the militia when they were caught and were able to kill 20 men. On Wednesday, September 9, 1739, Jemmy gathered 22 enslaved Africans near the Stono River, 20 miles southwest of Charleston. Acting on the day after the Feast of the Nativity of Mary connected their Catholic past with the present purpose, as did the religious symbols they used. The Africans marched down the roadway with a banner that read "Liberty" and chanted the same word in unison. They attacked a store at the Stono River Bridge, killing 2 storekeepers and seizing weapons and ammunition. Raising a flag, the slaves proceeded south toward Spanish Florida, a well-known refuge for escapees. On the way, they gathered more recruits, sometimes reluctant ones, for a total of 81. They burned 6 plantations and killed 23 to 28 whites along the way. While on horseback, South Carolina's Lieutenant Governor William Bull and 5 of his friends came across the group. They quickly went off to warn other slaveholders. Rallying a militia of planters and minor slaveholders, the colonists traveled to confront Jemmy and his followers. The next day, the well-armed and mounted militia, numbering from 19 to 99 men, caught up with a group of 76 slaves on the Edisto River. In the ensuing confrontation, 23 whites and 47 slaves were killed. While the slaves lost, they killed proportionately more whites than was the case in later rebellions. The colonists mounted the rebels' heads that were severed on stakes along significant roadways to serve as a warning for other slaves who might consider revolt. The lieutenant governor hired Chickasaw and Catawba Indians and other slaves to track and capture the Africans who had escaped from the battle. A group of the slaves who escaped fought a pitched battle with the militia a week later, approximately 30 miles from the first conflict site. The colonists executed most of the rebellious slaves. They sold the others off to the West Indian markets. Over the next 2 years, slave uprisings occurred independently in Georgia and South Carolina. The colonial officials believed the Stono Rebellion inspired these. Still, historians think the increasingly harsh condition of slavery since the 18th century under the rice and cotton cultures were sufficient to cause. Planters decided to develop a slave population, believing the workers were more content if they grew up enslaved. Attributing the rebellion to the recently imported African, planters chose to cut off the supply. They enacted a 10-year moratorium on slave importation through Charleston. A decade later, they opened the port to the international slave trade again. Planters imported slaves from areas other than Congo-Angolan regions. The Comprehensive Negro Act of 1740 was passed in the province of South Carolina during colonial Governor William Bull's time in office, in response to the Stono Rebellion. The act made it illegal for enslaved Africans to move abroad, assemble in groups, raise food, earn money, and learn to write, although reading was not prescribed. Additionally, owners were permitted to kill rebellious slaves if necessary. The act remained in effect until 1865. Samuel Johnson. American history is ingrained with its spirituality. The first 100 years or so of college education in the American colonies were dominated in New England by the Puritan theology of William Ames and the 16th century logical methods of Petrus Ramus. A donation of 800 books from England, collected by colonial agent Jeremiah Dummer, arrived at Yale. They contained what was known as the New Learning, including the works of Locke, Descartes, Newton, Boyle, and Shakespeare, and other Enlightenment-era authors not known to the tutors and graduates of Puritan Yale and Harvard colleges. They were first opened and studied by an 18-year-old graduate from Guilford, Connecticut, the young American Samuel Johnson, who had also just found and read Lord Francis Bacon's Advancement of Learning. Johnson wrote in his autobiography, "All this was like a flood of day to his low state of mind," and that he had found himself like one at once emerging out of the glimmer of twilight into the full sunshine of open day. He now considered what he had learned at Yale nothing but the scholastic cobwebs of a few little English and Dutch systems that would hardly now be taken up in the streets. Johnson was a seminal figure for American philosophy. Though busy with ministry and educational duties and raising his family, he never stopped learning or writing. He kept to his self-appointed mission to write up the sum of all knowledge. In February 1729, Johnson noted in his autobiography, "Came that very extraordinary genius, Bishop Berkeley, then Dean of Derry, into America and resided 2 years and a half at Rhode Island." Johnson hurried to visit him and his group in Rhode Island, including the painter John Smibert. For a time, he became a disciple of Berkeley's and exchanged many letters with the philosopher over the years, discussing Berkeley's idealist philosophy. Before Berkeley left America in September 1731, Johnson convinced Berkeley to donate to Yale many books, £500 sterling, and a 100-acre farm with £100 sterling yearly income, which would fund 3 scholars' college. Johnson published the essay An Introduction to the Study of Philosophy, exhibiting a general view of all arts and sciences, in the May 1731 issue of a London-based periodical, The Present State of the Republic of Letters. Written just as he was about to send his 2 stepsons to Yale, it was a manual for teaching young men ethics and moral philosophy. Things not taught yet, it had reverted to the Puritan curriculum. It was the first work published by an American in a British journal. In 1740s, while Johnson's son William Samuel Johnson was attending Yale, Johnson collaborated with Rector Thomas Clapp to create a new curriculum. He revised his moral philosophy and his tables on the sum of all knowledge. He published in a textbook titled An Introduction to the Study of Philosophy. It was 3 times longer than his previous essay. In large bold letters on the front page facing the title page, he proclaimed it a new system of morality. The work was intended from the beginning to accompany President Clapp of Yale's 1743 library catalog of the Library of the Yale College in New Haven. The work contained a moral philosophy textbook along with a revision of his table of the sum of all knowledge, which was used to Clapp to index his library catalog, and by Johnson to order a recommended reading list of books to be read at Yale students included as an appendix to the textbook. Though Johnson had begun replacing the Puritans' ideals of predestination and sin with his American Enlightenment idea of pursuing happiness as far back as his sermons in 1715, the new system makes the pursuit of happiness its starting point. In its opening paragraph, reflecting the influence of William Wollaston as well as Berkeley, he defines philosophy as the pursuit of true happiness in the knowledge of things as being what they are, and enacting or practicing according to that knowledge. Going beyond Wollaston and Berkeley, Johnson extended these men's constructions with unique practice-oriented ideas of perception leading to action, and a free will model of humans with a value system focused on pursuing happiness. Its library catalog schema, taken from Johnson's scheme, was adopted by other colleges and was superior to anything until Melville Dewey published his Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme in 1876. Johnson, who had first cataloged the Yale Library back in 1719 when his books were moved from Saybrook to New Haven, and who had secured the large Berkeley donation of books, selecting which volumes would go to Yale for the wealthy philosopher's extensive collection, has been called the father of American library classification. In 1743, for successful missionary work and his defense of the Anglican Church in America, he received an honorary doctorate of divinity from Oxford. He was only the third American to receive this honor. That same year he built the Second Christ Church in Stratford, startling his Puritan neighbors with Gothic-style architectural elements, heating, an organ, and a steeple with a clock and a bell, topped by a gold brass rooster. Dr. Johnson revised his moral philosophy textbook again, titling his Ethics Elementa, or the First Principles of Moral Philosophy. According to historians, this work had a high reputation at its publication and met with an extensive sale. He revised it again with editions released in 1752 in Philadelphia and 1754 in London. It contained a system of morals built upon his philosophical idealism, and the conclusion of this entire system of moral, philosophical, and rhetorical thought is that all human endeavor aims towards happiness, a condition realized when one fully understands and obeys God's will. The First Great Awakening. While I enjoy my vices, let's not forget about the faithfulness of this country. Historians called the First Great Awakening to be described as a revitalization of religious piety that swept through the American colonies between 1730s and the 1770s. That revival was part of a much broader movement, an evangelical upsurge taking place simultaneously on the other side of the Atlantic, most notably in England, Scotland, and Germany. In all these Protestant cultures, during the middle decades of the 18th century, a new age of faith rose to counter the currents of the Age of Enlightenment, to reaffirm the view that being genuinely religious meant trusting the heart rather than the head, prizing feeling more than thinking, relying on biblical revelation rather than human reason. The earliest manifestations of the American phrase of this phenomenon, the First Great Awakening, appeared among Presbyterians in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Led by the Tennant family, Reverend William Tennant, a Scots-Irish immigrant, and his 4 sons, all clergymen, the Presbyterians not only instigated religious revivals in those colonies during the 1730s, but also established a seminary to train clergymen whose fervid, heartfelt preaching would bring sinners to experience evangelical conversion. Originally known as the Log College, it's better known today as Princeton University. Religious enthusiasm quickly spread from the Presbyterians of the middle colonies of the Congregationalists, or Puritans, in New England's Baptists. By the 1740s, the clergymen of these churches were conducting revivals throughout the region, using the same strategy that contributed to the success of the Tennants. In emotionally charged sermons, more potent because they were delivered impromptu, preachers like Jonathan Edwards invoked vivid, terrifying images of the utter corruption of human nature and the terrors awaiting the unrepentant in hell. Hence Edwards' famous description of the sinner as a lonesome spider suspended by a slender thread over a pit of seething brimstone in his best-known sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. These early revivals in the northern colonies inspired some converts to become missionaries to the American South. In the late 1740s, Presbyterian preachers from New York and New Jersey began preaching in the Virginia Piedmont. By the 1750s, some group members known as the Separate Baptists moved from New England to central North Carolina and quickly extended their influence to surrounding colonies. By the eve of the American Revolution, these evangelical converts accounted for about 10% of all Southern churchgoers. The First Great Awakening also gained impetus from the wide-ranging American travels of the English preacher George Whitefield. Though Whitefield had been ordained as a minister in the Church of England, he later allied with other Anglican clergymen who shared his evangelical bent, most notably John and Charles Wesley. Together they led a movement to reform the Church of England, much as the Puritans had attempted earlier to reform that church, which resulted in the Methodist Church founding late in the 18th century. During his several trips across the Atlantic after 1739, Whitefield preached everywhere in the American colonies, often drawing audiences so large that he was obliged to preach outdoors. What Whitefield preached was nothing more than what other Calvinists had been proclaiming for centuries, that sinful men and women were dependent for salvation on the mercy of a pure, all-powerful God. But Whitefield and many American preachers who eagerly imitated his style presented that message in novel ways, gesturing dramatically, sometimes weeping openly, or thundering out threads of hellfire and brimstone that turned the sermon into a gripping theatrical performance. But not all looked on with approval. Throughout the colonies, conservative and moderate clergymen questioned evangelicals' emotionalism and charged that disorder and discord attended the revivals. They took significant exception to itinerants, ministers who, like Whitefield, traveled from one community to the other, preaching and all too often criticizing the local clergy. And they took still more significant exception when some white women and African Americans shared their subordinate social status long enough to provoke religious gatherings. Evangelical preachers and converts rejoined by lambasting their opponents as cold, uninspiring, and lacking righteousness and grace. Battles raged within the congregations and whole denominations over this challenge to clerical authority, as well as evangelical approaches to conversion from the heart rather than the head. So the First Great Awakening left colonials sharply polarized about religious lines. Anglican and Quakers gained new members among those who disapproved of the revival's excesses. Simultaneously, the Baptists, and in the 1770s the Methodists, made even more handsome gains from their ranks of radical evangelical converts. The largest single group of church-going Americans remained within the Congregationalist and Presbyterian denominations. Still, they divided internally between advocates and opponents of the Awakening, known respectively as New Lights and Old Lights. Inevitably, civil governments were drawn into the fray. In colonies where one denomination received state support, other churches lobbied legislators for disestablishment and end the Congregationalism's favored status in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and Anglicanism in the southern colonies. The first field of American music that could be viewed as popular rather than classic or folk was the singing of colonial New England choirs traveling singing masters like William Billings. Here, techniques and traditions like shape note, lined out hymnody, and sacred harp were created, gradually spreading south and becoming an integral part of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 40s was a period of religious fervor among whites and blacks, both slave and free, that saw passionate evangelical Negro spirituals grow in popularity. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster. and this was the RPTM podcast.